Welcome back to my kitchen here at Trails N62. I've been doing a lot of canning here lately, getting ready for winter, doing a bunch of meals in a jar. Today it's going to be beef stew. Now I've got some stew meat that, well, quite frankly, I didn't buy any stew meat. My parents had some in their freezer, been in there for a while, needs to be used up, so they just had a little bit in there well, it was kind of getting along in date, so it needed to be used. So I brought it home and I've thawed it out, and I'm getting ready to make some beef stew. I'll be making these in 1.5 jars. They're wide mouth, and mainly because I don't have many regular mouth lids left. I was kind of hoping this shortage would get through, but hopefully before next canning season it'll get through. I don't know why there's a shortage. Doesn't seem to be a reason for it. Nobody's ever said that I've seen that there's a reason for the shortage. So I assume that most of these factories that make these in Ball and Kerr and here in the U.S. are pretty much automated for the most part, so I don't understand why there's such a big shortage of them. I could see maybe a little bit, but there's been such a huge shortage, you just can't hardly find them. And so all these off-brands are coming on the market. I got some off-brands from Amazon, and I've used some of those, but I still have a few of my 1.5 jars that I've never used before, so they're still good in the box. They come with the lid, so I'll have those. So we're going to be doing beef stew, and I'll be using some stew meat, some red potatoes, and some other ingredients in here. And like everybody, you know, kind of has their own recipe for stew. That's okay. This is what I'm doing here. I'll be making this beef stew for my winter meals coming up, and it's going to be pretty good. Like everything, if you need a little more liquid with it, whatever your liquid base is of your canned product, if you need it more liquid, just put some more of that in it when you're heating it up. In this case, I'm going to be using beef stock as my base for my beef stew. Now the other thing on this is that I've had to kind of adjust the menu, the recipe for 1.5 because the recipe I had was for pint. So they're kind of approximated based on the jars. And just as long as you leave an inch head space at the top of the jar, that's the main thing right there. If you have to take something out, to leave that, take something out. But leave that inch head space because that's important in your canning process. Now I know a lot of people like to just make up a bunch of stew and chili or something like that and then can what's left. Well, you can do that. It's okay. It works. I've never done it, but I know of people that have. And if you're like me, it used to be if I made up a big old bowl of stew or big old pot of stew, big old pot of chili or something like that, you know, I start out thinking small, but as I add to it, it keeps growing and growing and growing. Next thing you know, I got a huge pot. And we used to eat it for days. So if you do that, you wind up with extra. You can go ahead and can it. Just put it in your jars. Make sure the proportions of your product in there is good. This is why I'm going to be layering this in the jars. I'm not going to cook it up first, mix it up first, and then put it in the jars. I'll be layering it using raw meat because it will can and it will cook in the process plenty good enough and make some of its own juices. So if you've got a big pot and you're putting it in, make sure you have it proportioned with the amount of stuff in the jars. You don't want to have one jar that's all potatoes, you know, or all carrots, or all potatoes and carrots and no meat. So that's the only thing about making a big pot and putting it in the jars, is make sure you have the proper proportions in there so you have a good stew. But I'm going to be layering mine because I want to make sure I have the same amount, or roughly the same amount in each jar. And we'll get started here with our beef stew in a jar. Alright, once again I'm going to be using my Nesco electric canner, so it will only hold 4 of these 1.5 jars or quart jars, either one. But these are 1.5 jars, and we're going to start with our beef in the bottom of it. And basically what we're going to have here, roughly 2/3 cup is what I'm looking at of beef. Of course, you can't measure it exactly because let me use my funnel there so I don't get it on the edge, because it's chunks. But these happen to have a measurement in the bottom of them, or on the side of the jars, so I can roughly see 2/3 a cup. Okay, those roughly have the same amount in them, so that's going to be good. Next we're going to do 2/3 cup of potatoes, and it's the same with the potatoes. It's going to kind of rough to get 2/3 because they're chunky. Now I've got my potatoes cut up inch squares, something like that. Notice my beef was cut up too, and I'm just going to use a strainer here. It's about 2/3 cup in a strainer. I measured it. So there's my beef, and there's my potatoes. Next is going to be 1/4 cup of carrots. Now I'm using carrots that I already canned once because I don't eat canned carrots. They were canned earlier. So they've already been cooked once, but that's okay because it's the flavor that I'm looking for the carrots. Not necessarily the carrots. After that, I'm going to put in a tablespoon of peas. These happen to be frozen peas that I've thawed out here. And then I'm going to put a tablespoon of diced celery. And then I'm going to put in a tablespoon of diced onions. Now a lot of times when you do the onions, they need to be processed, blanched. But since I'm just putting them in layers like this, and there's only like 1 tablespoon in a jar, they'll cook up just fine, won't be a problem. Next I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of minced garlic. It's kind of a heaping 1/4 teaspoon. I kind of like my garlic. And then following that, we're going to go with a 1/4 teaspoon of, the recipe calls for canning salt. I don't know that you would necessarily have to use canning salt, but I happen to have some, so that's what I'll use. Following the canning salt, then we have a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. And then we have a 1/2 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce. And then following that, we have 1/8 teaspoon of paprika. I happen to have smoked paprika, so that's what I'll use. And then finally, we're going to add our beef broth and debubble. Again, make sure we leave 1 inch of headspace on there. We debubble it to make sure we get the liquid in everything. We don't want a bunch of air pockets down in there. That'll hinder the processing of the stew. Now my beef broth is hot, so my jars are, because the meat was cold, So my jars are going to be warm, and that's the way I want it, because when I put it in the canner, it will be hot water. So you always need to make sure your jars are warm or hot when you put them in hot water. If your jars are cold, you don't want to put them in hot water, just lukewarm water. The canner calls for hot water in there. But if your jars are cold, you don't want to stick them down in the hot water. Juice in here. A little more juice in here. A little more juice in here. Add a bit more in here. Just to fill it up to the 1 inch mark. Alright. Next we're going to wipe our rims. And again, we'll wipe our rims with vinegar because there is meat in here. Pour our vinegar in our canner because we've got hard water. And the back. You didn't even know I was gone, did you? That's because I can edit these videos. Well, I made a blunder and I had to clean up my mess. I had forgotten that I'd taken the inner pot out of my pressure canner, and set it off to the side so it could cool, because I like to start with a cool canner. I've already done one batch of things this morning, and so I needed to start with a cool canner. I forgot I took it out and hadn't put it back in and hadn't put the water in it yet, and so I wasn't even looking when I reached over and dumped the vinegar into the pot, and there wasn't no pot in there to dump it into. So naturally my vinegar was down inside the deal, and so I'm trying to move it to get it off out of the way so it wouldn't drain vinegar all over the place, and I could dry it off and clean it off and see if everything was all right. And I knocked my pepper off into the floor and strung it out all over the floor. What little pepper I had left, I got none now. And so it was all over the floor, and vinegar was all over everything. About 1/4 cup of vinegar, I guess, that I'd put in there. So it was all over the place, so I had to clean it up. But I'm back on track now, and hopefully everything will work. Hopefully the pressure canner will work all right. I don't think there was anything in there that would have been damaged by it, but we'll find out when we get the pressure cooking. My next call may be to the fire department. We'll see. Alright, so we're ready to put our lids on our beef stew. I did re-wipe the rims because they were sitting there while I was cleaning up. Just checking to see if I actually put the hot water in there this time. Again, finger tight on these. I like to screw them down snug and then snug them down finger tight. One-inch head space and into the canner. Again, as with anything that you're canning with liquid, make sure that you keep that thing upright. Don't tilt it, don't tip it over, because then you'll get stuff underneath the lid. Until that seals, you can always get something underneath the lid. And there's our 4 pint-and-a-halfs in our Nesco pressure canner. Close lid, lock it, plug it in, get her started up. 90 minutes for these pint-and-a-halfs, just like you would for a quart. And if you're doing pint, 75 minutes. Alright, we'll get these done then. Well, just a little update here. Everything seems to be working alright. It's got on the 10-minute countdown, down to 3 minutes now. The only thing that I see is there is a little bit of condensation right in here behind this. So I'm thinking something down in the bottom got hot, and there's a little condensation right in here. But so far, it's working. Let's hope it keeps on going. Okay, we're on 79 minutes here, counting down from our 90 minutes. Everything seems to be all right. Condensation is even cleared up. So hopefully it's working right, which is good. Finished up. I ended up with 6 pint-and-a-half jars of beef stew. And they all sealed, looked good. I did have one jar broke on me in the canner, and it was right at the very first before it even started venting, so I was able to get it out and finish up the canning of the last 2 jars. I actually had 3 jars and a pint-and-a-half of sloppy Joe mix that I stuck in there with it to fill it up. But anyway, got her done, looking good. Well, that's it for beef stew. Pint-and-a-half jars, all canned up. So next time, from my house to yours, from my kitchen to your kitchen, God bless.